wisdom,
prudentia,
justice,
justitia,
temperance,
temperantia,
courage.
fortitudo.
Applying ancient philosophy to modern life, this is the Sunday Stoic.
Welcome to the Sunday Stoic, a podcast by Steve Carapet. This week's your hosts are Dr. Greg Sadler, professor of philosophy, editor of the Stoicism Today blog, and philosophy YouTuber extraordinaire, and myself, Dan Hayes, tech entrepreneur and Procopton. But no Steve. We, however, have a great show on the topic of
dialogue and the benefits it bestows. So what we have in mind, and this was actually Dan's suggestion, so I'm just kind of along for the ride, but I think it's perfectly on point, is that this is something absolutely vital to development as a Stoic, engaging with other people. And there's not as much attention to this in the classic Stoic texts as we might want, right? So what was the basic idea that you had when we first started kicking this around?
It's the whole idea that we can read things, and because language is such a amorphous topic that we, especially as thousands of years have gone by between the time of the original Stoics writings, as well as the different translations and the way that language changes, like what they considered logic doesn't actually map one-to-one onto what we consider logic nowadays, or there are many other particular words that are used within those are not the same definitions, and one way that we can come to those more correct conclusions is having enough people with enough different experiences and knowledge in order to help us come to a more concrete and defendable position on what, I guess, the Stoics are saying, and if we actually want to agree upon these ideas. And so I rely upon you a lot, for you can read Greek and often come in with like, oh, this word that they're translating is actually this word in the Greek, and so this might be a better translation for this particular idea. And if I was just reading what I can read by myself, I would have lost a lot of the nuance in that.
I should mention that what Dan is mentioning here is we're in the Milwaukee Stoic Fellowship together. We're both co-organizers, and when we were having face-to-face meetings, sometimes different people would come in with different issues, and we were looking at texts, and then that's the context that we would do that. And I think that there's a lot of other ways in which having dialogue is helpful as well. People bringing in their own life problems. You mentioned having like a wider context, if I remember right, brought by having additional people in the conversation. You know, this is something that we don't see a lot in the classic Stoic text, but it must have been there in early Stoic practice, you'd think, right?
Yeah. Originally, Zeno is hanging out in the Stoa, this covered porch, painted porch, walkway area with colonnades and whatnot. And a lot of times that they're going to the gym and then hanging out here and talking about philosophy afterwards. And so it's like, hey, it's a whole bunch of guys, I guess, and gals potentially, hanging out and talking about their problems and trying to understand them the best they can. And so it seems like that this dialogue is essential, at least for the early Stoa, is essential for early Socratic and beyond philosophy in Greece.
Yeah, and we do have some records of conversations that Epictetus had where, it's Arian writing these down, but presumably he either heard about these or saw these conversations himself, where people come in and they've got a problem, or they have what they think is one problem, but it turns out to be another problem, like the guy who was a local official and got ticked off that when he was in the theater, people didn't see things his way, and they started yelling at him for judging comedy wrong when he was yelling at them. There's a lot of this sort of like day-to-day life issue stuff that must have played a significant role. And again, we don't have many of the Stoic texts, so we're kind of presuming here. Seneca talks about some of this stuff from time to time as well, with little anecdotes here and there. So it is part of it, but I think it can easily get overlooked. And I did want to, before we jump into talking about how Stoicism naturally leads into this, I wanted to tackle something that you and I have seen quite a lot of, which is this notion that Stoicism is a very individualistic way of approaching things. And I think that's a misunderstanding of Stoicism, right?
Yeah. The Stoics definitely talk about kind of harnessing your own rationality and to not be, I guess, slave or under the control of pure emotion. But that is all in service of actually being a more moral and pro-social individual within the society in which that you are living.
Yeah, you can say there's like emphasis on personal responsibility. You don't get to blame the other guy for ticking you off, right? Mm-hmm. It's your feelings. You're on your own with them in a certain way. But that doesn't mean that you should withdraw from people, or that the goal should be being a hermit out in the forest or desert, wherever it's going to be, getting away from all the other human beings. You're a Stoic in the middle of human society.
Yeah, if you wanted to do that, you'd be a cynic. And the Stoics are like, okay, we can take a lot of the ideas from Stoicism, but because we are social creatures and we do live within these larger communities, how do you still maintain this communion with all these other people and still keep your head on your shoulders?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. So we have some prime examples of this social aspect within classical Stoicism. Some of this comes from not specifically Stoic sources, like Cicero, who was an admirer of the Stoics but didn't identify as a Stoic, although he does say in the Tusculan Disputation somewhere that if he wasn't an academic, he'd be a Stoic. So it's sort of second best, right?
Uh-huh.
And in On Duties, and in other places as well, he articulates something that we later on call natural law. The general idea is that human beings have a fundamental human nature, and there's certain aspects that are kind of baked into it or built into it. And one of these that leads us ultimately to seeing justice as a virtue and taking account of this is what Dan has been calling our pro-social nature, meaning that we not only do have a social nature, that we're, like other animals, and that we associate in whatever you want to call them, packs, herds, groups of some sort, but that we also value the living together. We value the things that allow us to have a common life. And it's tough to do that. To have a common life. There's always challenges. So this is what leads us into consideration of one of the four cardinal virtues, which is justice. And obviously just that feeling by itself, however basic it is, that's not enough to make us just people. We got to do a lot of other conceptual and practical work. But the Stoics think that that's there in every single one of us. I mean, it might be there less in some people. Childhood traumas might kind of screw it up, but it's still part of our basic package.
Yeah, and I believe that this idea of cosmopolitanism also comes into play here, where the Stoics believe that we are a polis, a people of the cosmos, and it's not that we need to, that there are many different roles that we need to take into account depending upon where we are within our family and in our smaller society, our city-state, or our nation, but that we also have another circle in which we have a role to play within, and that is the cosmopolitan role, and how that we need to make our decisions, at least partially, in relation to how these things are going to affect all the other people in the cosmos, all the rational creatures.
Yeah, I was just thinking about this the other day as I was reading a piece of science fiction, actually, by a Chinese author, the three-body problem. And in it, they are sending out messages, radio messages to other civilizations, not knowing who's actually out there. And one of the things that they mentioned, because they're talking about the entirety of the human race, is that the human race developed many cultures. And I thought that's kind of a cool thing to point out. We're not a monoculture. We have all these different cultures that people come from. And, human beings are not reducible to their cultures, so you can't say, oh, this person's a Greek, so I know everything about them, right? Because we're way more complex than that. But in the ancient world, being Greek as opposed to being Persian, as opposed to being Etruscan, that made a significant difference. And cosmopolitanism It is saying everybody's part of one, I don't want to say one big happy family, one big polis, one big political and social community, but it didn't require effacing all the differences. And this is where we can get to, jumping ahead, talking about why dialogue is useful. When you talk to people who are coming from things and you've got things in common with them, but they're coming from things from a different perspective to your own, whether it be national origin or culture, whether it be in our society, race is a huge divider, gender, socioeconomic class, disability, all these sorts of things can be very helpful for us in, learning what we need to actually take into account as we're trying to think through what does it mean to be just? What does it mean to be courageous? Mm-hmm. How do I apply these Stoic principles? So I think cosmopolitanism is actually a really rich concept that we could explore in this case.
Yeah, the fact that depending on our cultural background and our family background and the experiences that we gained, we have certain preconceptions about how we work and how the world works. And once we are faced with a person that has a very different understanding of how the world works, we have either two major choices. We can either wholly reject that and say, no, my understanding of the world is real and perfectly rational and of the absolute truth of the thing, or we can say, okay, maybe I'll take a step back and at least explore how they came to these different conclusions that I think are bedrock, but are diametrically opposed.
That's a really interesting idea, because what that ties into is a couple other key Stoic practices. That of questioning appearances, right, which is absolutely central to Stoic practice. If I, through talking with somebody else, can realize that something I take for granted as being true might only be true some of the time or in a qualified way, I can now start questioning those appearances. So that might be a necessary condition. And then going beyond that, I think we could also say, so questioning appearances is very helpful, but we also talk about depersonalization, right? When we see what other people... The classic Stoics actually do talk about this. When we see what other people consider possible for them, it may open up possibilities for ourselves that we didn't think were possible. So to use an example that Epictetus goes back to, and so does Seneca, Socrates, right? If Socrates could do it, we could do it. But we could also say, hey, if these people over here who don't seem to be bothered by the things that I'm bothered by are able to slough it off, maybe that's a possibility for me too. What do they got that I'm missing out on?
Why should I be, as Epictetus say, a slave to these things that are external to me?
Yeah. Another thing that I think is a resource in classic Stoicism, and I think that Marcus Aurelius is probably the person who talks about this the most, is this notion that we, as human beings, are parts of greater wholes. And, he stresses over and over again, what's good for the whole is good for the part, even though the part may not realize it. And I was just thinking as I was bringing up that idea, some wholes are not really the wholes that we need to belong to. You and I are both Packers fans, and there is this notion of Packer Nation, but that's not really an important rational whole when you get down to it. It's kind of fun to chit-chat about that, but that's not how we ought to be conceiving of ourselves. But if we think about our community, both of us as residents of Milwaukee wanting to see the city prosper, but, when we say that, we don't just mean the better parts of the city, that get all the attention. We want to see the whole city pull together and make it through COVID, or education be better for students in some of the less funded schools, or part of the reason why we put together the Milwaukee Stoic Fellowship in the first place, to make it a resource available for people in the Milwaukee area. That's an example of a whole that you and I as individuals could be part of, that it makes sense for us to realize ourselves as part of it. Even though, the city's not a perfect community and we could get sucked into things that maybe take our time or resources, we could still think of it as something, a good motif, for how we should understand our life.
Marcus talks about okay, there's the hands, the feet, the teeth, the arms, the legs, and the foot, and sometimes the foot is tread through the mud, but it's treading through that mud that is beneficial for every other part. And I would say it's really important to actually understand the organizations in which that you are a part of. So, for example, like being part of a city and trying to do what's like best for the benefit of the citizens and the economic benefit for development of the entire place, that's pretty good. But if you're part of like a pyramid scheme, everyone's the foot except for like a very small amount, and so like the aggregate benefit is not that there's one or two people that have to be the foot sometimes. It's everyone's the foot except for a couple. And then all of a sudden this polis that you are now part of is not a beneficial one.
You know, this is a little bit off topic, but it reminds me of something from my Army days. We would get our feet inspected periodically by our NCOs, our non-commissioned officers, because if you're always spending your time on your feet, we were a mechanized unit, but we still have to march around a lot. If your feet go bad, then you're in trouble. And one of the things that I found out is that within the British Army, this was taken much more seriously. Officers were supposedly, I don't know if this is actually true, but it's kind of an interesting thought. If enlisted soldiers were having problems with their feet that could have been prevented by actually paying attention to them, giving them the proper care that they should have, then the officer would get in trouble for it. Rather than like the American Army where they'd probably, give you some foot cream and then also tell you to do a better job yourself, right? And so, this metaphor of the foot being stuck in the mud and all of that, I think you're right. A pyramid scheme is a case where everybody's a foot except for the few people who get to be, the eyes or something like that. And maybe, in every social body, there have to be some feet, but we can take care of the feet or we can let them rot and treat them badly, right? So I think the Stoics would say we need to treat all of the organs properly.
Yeah, there's a reciprocity, and for a good organization, the ones at the top have a strong care and respect even for those lesser portions of it, because they understand that if they don't take care of those lesser portions of the organization, then the entire organization itself fails. And it's not that the head or the eyes in this analogy can ever just ignore the needs of the feet, but need to be aware and be constantly attending to these needs.
Yeah. There's a couple other interesting things in classic Stoicism that I think really flesh out this social nature. The idea of what we can call role ethics. You see this most in Epictetus, but also in the other Stoics who we have, that each person exists within a matrix, a complex matrix of relationships, and our duties are signified to us by the roles that we have if we properly understand them. So like being a parent, there's roles that are incumbent on that, particular ways of living out wisdom, justice, courage, and temperance that are different than, say, being a teacher or being a traffic cop or whatever it's going to be, right? And, understanding those, valuing those, and also not allowing the fact that other people don't always fulfill those roles to tempt us into saying, screw it, I'm not going to do it either. That's another one of those aspects of the pro-social nature in Stoicism, or rather that Stoicism explains to us and shows us the implications of.
Yeah, and this brings us to our ideas of concentric circles, which, as described by the Stoic Heracles, the idea of okiosis, and this idea that, as our roles, we have certain circles in which we have caring, and we're going to bring this back to cosmopolitanism, in that, we have a certain, our first circle is ourselves, and then outside of that is we are parents or our close siblings or our wives or husbands or significant others, and then outside of that you have your extended family, and outside of that you have maybe your neighborhood, and outside of that your city, outside of that your state, and then outside of that your whole the cosmos of like all rational creatures. And he speaks about this idea of we should strive to try to construct these circles in order that we feel closer to the ideal of having the same feelings that we have for our closest relatives as we would have for every person in the cosmos, this cosmopolitan sense. And it's a hard ideal, just kind of like the idea of the Stoic sage is a hard ideal, but it's at least a direction, a vector towards which we're trying to get to.
An interesting aspect of that with Heracles and the whole notion of oikeiosis in general, because Heracles is the main person that we have texts from, but we know that this plays a role in other Stoic thinkers based on what we have from non-Stoic thinkers writing about it. So affection is a major part of it, right? Feeling a care or concern about other people. And yeah, it's much easier to feel concern about, for example, my kids or my wife than it is for me to feel concern about somebody who I don't actually know walking on the street in my part of Milwaukee, let alone somebody on the other side of the planet. But, another aspect of oikeiosis is self-knowledge. We love ourselves in knowing ourselves. And we want to preserve our own being in existence, and we do the things that, augment our lives. So getting to know other people would be part of that expanding the circles. It wouldn't just be feeling affection towards them. It's like wanting to get to know them, wanting to know what their lives are like, wanting to know what sort of challenges they face, wanting to know who they are. Mm-hmm. And again, you're right. It can't be. It's an ideal. It can't be done with every single person. We don't have the time for that, but we can certainly be responsive to the needs of strangers,
and try to not totally put them out of mind. A lot of times we get so insular that we don't even see these circles outside of the ones that are closest to us, and it is a exercise in actually coming into understanding that there are a lot more of us that have a lot of wants and needs and desires, and that as a member of the world that we need to at least have some understanding of this.
Those are some key aspects of ancient Stoic doctrine, I think, that are very helpful for us. And then, there's other aspects of what the Stoics did. If you look at all the advice that they're giving us, there's a lot of focus on our connections to other people, not getting drawn off course by the dominant culture, which is giving us bad messages, how to deal with the bad behavior of others without letting ourselves get drawn into imitating them or being harmed by them, and, responding well. And so I think you can say that that's less about how to isolate yourself and more about that social side. And then, as you pointed out, we have examples of relationships in the social aspect in Stoicism. The Stoa Poikile, it was people hanging out together, not just each of them getting their book and retiring off to the corner and saying, I'm going to study it on my own. You stay away. Zeno had a school, right?
Yeah.
And they were not just a school, they were a community as well. And we have other examples, I think, that are helpful. Epictetus, became somebody beloved by his own city enough that when he died, they memorialized him. An emperor came to visit him, Hadrian, when he had the chance, and he had his own school there as well, and he was a contributing member of that society. We also have, some more political involvements with somebody like Seneca, who was an advisor, an unsuccessful advisor to Nero. And, Cato was heavily involved in politics too, right? So there's all these examples. When people say, I'm going to practice Stoicism by withdrawing from my society, whether it be understood in terms of political associations or organizations or stuff like that, it seems like the ancient Stoics would say, you've totally misunderstood what Stoicism is about to those people.
Right. This insular, nihilistic idea of Stoicism, to a certain extent, of it's outside of my control and thus it doesn't matter, is such a narrow reading of it that it twists the actual meaning to something that is absolutely almost opposite of what it's trying to put forward.
Yeah, so that's an interesting point. So the dichotomy of control, which is an important doctrine, are you saying that when it's isolated from other Stoic ideas that it leads us astray?
Yeah, I've referred to it as the Stoic Trap, and it's also similar than in Buddhism. There's also a similar Buddhist trap of removing yourself from the physical world to a point where you can see if you're in this insular, it's only about me and my perception and those things that I can control, and then you see something reprehensible happening outside of you, and you're like, well, that's not up to me anymore. Let them go and I don't know, put political dissidents into prison or something, or a number of other things. And you're just like, well, not my problem. Then you're fundamentally missing that we are part of a polis, and that we have certain roles within that, and that we have a certain duty to those people that we are a part of in order to make sure that we have some sort of pro-social beneficial actions happening for the whole.
Yeah, that makes sense. I like that idea of it being a trap. And notice it's the same concept, but it really depends on the context that you put it in. If the dichotomy of control is in with the other key Stoic ideas, then it does its job. If it's by itself having to bear the entire brunt, then it gets deformed and it no longer does what it's supposed to do. This is a great segue into one of the things that you wanted to talk about in terms of language and understanding, and why dialogue is so important. Understanding what terms mean, what the concepts are. So I'll let you explain what you had in mind by that.
So first I want to kind of define natural language versus formal language. And natural language is basically all the human languages that have ever arisen naturally from just people developing cultures, and we started turning sounds into being associated with meanings, but it almost never are any of these like actual spoken human languages developed with a strict adherence to this sound always means this one thing, and there's no ambiguity in it, there's no like poetic usage of it. It always means one thing and one thing only, and that is what we would refer to as a formal language. And a formal language is basically every single computer language is a formal language, because computers don't do nuance, they just execute instructions.
Yeah.
But there's, at least in most computer languages, there's not a lot of good ways of conveying abstract ideas.
Okay.
And because of the fact that we are natural language users, and that languages themselves change over time, this ability to transfer ideas and knowledge over time sometimes degrade unless you have enough like exegesis and understanding of the original words, especially if things are translated, in order to make sure that you're understanding the idea itself and not getting thrown down these rabbit holes to incorrect understanding just because there is a semantic issue.
Because the word is being used differently now than it was, say, when it was being translated by Old Father for Epictetus, right?
Right. And like, heck,
Okay.
you see like languages in the last 10 years, like things that meant one thing are now like meaning the exact opposite. And it's fine. It is the nature of language. It's not something that we need to like rail against. Although,
how does having other people to talk with, engaging in dialogue, how does that help out in that respect then?
more people with more background and experiences allow us to have, without having to do all of this studying and sitting 20, 30 years in the library just poring over texts and learning several dead languages, to actually, if we come together as a group, we now as a group have a much larger body of knowledge to pull from, and we can help to define and refine these ideas and make sure that we're not coming to worse conclusions.
Okay.
Also, a lot of times when we get together in groups, especially concerning Stoicism, because a lot of Stoicism is, it's a moral philosophy, and people come in with moral dilemmas and how they should be actually interacting with each other, and so we try to take the Stoic principles and try to apply it to these particular situations. And just the fact of actually walking through, okay, here's the situation, and here's what we believe the Stoics are trying to convey here is, and then we try to figure out what would be the solution, and it's very often really useful, especially because if it's our own problem, then sometimes it's too close for us to accurately investigate, and it's useful to have someone else to talk these things through with.
Yeah, and also going back to what you were saying about relying on people, say, who can look at the ancient Greek and then say, well, this is a better translation. I know that for myself, both in our small groups and also with my college students, finding out what the possible interference areas will be is often really helpful for me as I'm trying to explain something. If I know that this is not just a term, but a concept that is likely to get mistaken, or this passage is likely to get misread in this way, then I can produce a better explanation of it for people, or help them apply it better.
Like, for example, like one of the big things is happiness within Stoicism, and what does eudaimonia actually translate to, and is happiness the best way, or maybe human flourishing is a better English translation?
The term virtue and vice too. I think those require a lot of explanation for some people coming in at the start or from the outside.
Not to mention that virtue and vice have been co-opted hard by Christianity and have now this extra baggage, especially from the Catholic Church, added on to them, and not all of that actually coincides with the original meaning.
Yeah, so I mean, it depends on which Catholic we're talking about. If we're talking about Augustine, there's almost no daylight between him and the Stoics on the meaning of virtue or vice. If we're talking about somebody reading the Catechism today without that background, yeah, that could definitely be an issue. So there's a lot to be gained by engaging in discussion with other people. You mentioned people bringing in their problems, concerns, obstacles, mishaps, misunderstandings as opportunities for us to learn. And I don't know. I mean, I think I've certainly had cases in the past where somebody asking a question helped me understand that I had been misunderstanding something for a while, both not just with Stoicism, but with all sorts of other things in the course of my life. So I imagine that's a pretty common experience, right?
And one of the things is it requires you to be, I guess, courageous enough to be humble in these situations. That's
a good point. Yeah.
If we have an idea, doesn't mean that the idea is absolutely true, especially if in the face of overwhelming evidence is seen to be false. Then it is much better, much more virtuous, much more excellent to remove that incorrect conception and to actually appropriate the correct conception.
That's true. Yeah. That's a good point. Another thing that I thought would be kind of interesting to talk about is accountability. When we meet together in these groups, whatever they happen to be like, could be small groups, could be larger ones, that could be monthly, could be weekly. We have the opportunity to get to know people over time and what their dispositions are like and what they particularly struggle with. And we can reinforce good behavior. We can call people out on bad behavior without going too far or not going far enough with our calling out. And I think that's really important for moral development. We do have to not just say, well, you're on your path, I'm on my path. we have to, if there is a common set of goals, common orientation towards these things, then presumably we can help each other that way, right?
Yeah, the whole, I guess, agree to disagree, or like, well, you have your ideas or your facts or something, doesn't actually solve any issues, because they're just saying, no, I'm just going to double down on whatever I believe, and I'm not even going to take your position or your understanding into consideration.
That's an interesting idea there. Yeah. That the withdrawal from other people in order to, preserve sort of a mistaken sense of civility doesn't really do people favors. I mean, it could be instrumentally useful, like if we want to keep from having conflict with people who are very contentious, maybe there's some point to that. But if we're trying to grow and we're trying to become better people, then maybe we can accept that provisionally, but we say we're going to have to come back to this later. Yeah. We can't just agree to disagree and everybody goes their merry ways.
Right. Otherwise, there's no growth.
Do you think that this is something that is necessary or just desirable when it comes to moral development in Stoic philosophy? So could you do without it and be just fine?
I think you could potentially do without it. It'd be a lot harder and a lot slower.
Okay. So it's a way of doing things better.
Yeah.
To engage in dialogue with other people.
And that's like the same way for most things. You go to university and you're supposed to read the material before you get there, hopefully, in order to actually refine these ideas so that it's not the first time that you're being introduced to them while you're actually in class. And hopefully your class is small enough that you can actually have some sort of dialogue.
Yeah.
Because there's lots of research on how we learn things, and it's through repeated exposure to the same ideas and materials, and that's the way that we build up these pathways that represent our memories in our minds. And going through these things and not just like reading through some of the text once is like, well, I got it now. Totally can go off and say like I'm a great Stoic philosopher or something.
Yeah.
Then you have to actually think through these things and look through them at different ways, and the best way to do that is in communion with all these other people that are trying to move towards the same goal.
Yeah, that reminds me, this is a bit off topic, but of a core question that I answered a while back. Somebody said, what do I need to do to master Stoicism? And my response is basically, well, not that. You can't master Stoicism. It's not a masterable sort of thing. And adopting the idea that things are going to be one and done, or, I'm going to like get to a certain checkpoint and things will be crossed off, and now I'm like certified as a Stoic. It just doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way with any sort of intentional way of living, because human beings are complicated, and we have to be able to respond flexibly to the situations based on the principles that we've internalized and made into what we use habitually. And maybe that's something that, you could do that on your own, but maybe that is something that you have to do with other people so that you're getting some feedback, so that you're bouncing things off of them. And maybe sometimes even just having different temperaments. Like I know I benefit by having people who are, who have less issues with anger management telling me, hey, you really went overboard on that one. And I'll be like, I think I was just right. And they'll be like, no, you still have a ways to go. You could have done things differently this way. So maybe it is not absolutely necessary, but it certainly is something helpful, something desirable. What are some other ways that you think dialogue benefits us if we're studying Stoicism?
So I would like to bring in the discipline of Ascent, which we touched on just a little bit earlier. We need to understand the world as best we can in order to make the correct decisions and how we should act within it. And we start from flawed presuppositions, and any good reasoned decisions that are based on that are on firm ground. And so we talk about like optical illusions with Stoicism. It's like, okay, you see something one way from one particular point of view, but that doesn't mean that is the thing. And the whole idea of like, you are just an impression, and not all the thing in which you suppose or pretend to be is one of these at-hand principles. And it's like, you can't just take one look and totally understand the entirety of the situation on the ground. It takes a little bit of study and time to look at from many different perspectives and make sure that you have full, strong understanding and knowledge. And so Cicero speaks about how Zeno tries to use an analogy to give an understanding of this. And so Zeno professed to illustrate this by a piece of action, for when he stretched out his fingers and showed the palm of his hand, perception, said he, it is the thing like this. Then, when he had closed his fingers, assent is like this. Afterwards, when he had completely closed his hand and held fist forth, he then said comprehension. But when he brought his left hand against his right, and when he took it firm and held tight on his fist, knowledge, he said, was of that character, and that was what none but the wise man possessed. And so, in a little bit more straightforward terms, raw impression is an outstretched hand. A closed hand is assent. A clenched fist is comprehension. And a fist with another hand on top of it, closed together, was knowledge. And that it takes a lot of assent to many different things to actually look at this and to probe it in many different ways to actually have a portion of knowledge. Because, once again, it's this multiple perspectives. And if we say things like we look at it and we have a whole bunch of baggage that we bring to the table and preconceptions from our own personal experiences through our lives, and we might think that we have this knowledge in the very first place from all of our experiences, But once again, we go back to, okay, well, someone has a whole different set of preconceptions, and they come to a totally different conclusion that is absolutely incompatible with the conclusion that you think is knowledge. And all of a sudden, you realize that your knowledge might not be as strong and on good footing as what you had thought about it.
Well, that makes good sense. And here, let me actually ask you about a supplementary idea with that. So the way that the Stoics present it, and I think this is pretty common, is to view assent as like my assent is my assent, your assent is your assent. Are we involved in any way, other than at the beginning of like adding extra information, are we involved in helping people to assent to what they should and not to assent to what they shouldn't by being engaged in dialogue? So when I say, oh man, I think you're off base on that, is that helpful in any way with this process of arriving at, genuine knowledge?
I'd say absolutely.
How so?
If you don't know that people dissent from what you are assenting to, then you have no basis for you to start to reconsider the position that you're holding. And it's kind of like we can lead a horse to water, but we can't make him drink. But at least there's the water there presented, whereas beforehand, the horse didn't even have the option of drinking.
Okay, so the process of what in literary studies they call defamiliarization, not taking things for granted. And I could see how it could also be helpful to have somebody who's further along to say, here, come follow me on this path, right? Do we get anything else out of engaging with others in dialogue in, say, Stoic groups that would have to do with assent? Or is that, say, the totality of it?
I'm adverse to trying to say that is the totality of it, because that is a rather absolutist statement. And even though something isn't coming to mind immediately, does not mean that there aren't other benefits.
So we'll leave it as an open question.
Yes.
So we should close by talking a little bit about why we brought this up in the first place. And I think this comes from our own experiences. Dan and I work closely together now for, at least 2 years, the Milwaukee Stoic Fellowship, and we've had a number of experiences of the productive capacity for dialogue between people who are interested in Stoicism. And I thought it would be good to talk a little bit about our experiences that we've had. And one of the things we were going to talk about is the Stoicon big conference itself, which I've been to 3 times. I don't think you've been to any of them, have you?
Not physically, no.
Yeah. And then recently, of course, everything's gone online. Dan and I co-organized Stoicon X Midwest and chaired the different panels. And actually, we had a great conversation at the end about organizing. So I think we could talk about that. But we also have, Dan has been organizing something that started out as walk and talks and has morphed into something different, a weekly Stoic group. So I think that would be a great place to talk about this as well.
Yeah, the different ways in which we communicate result in different dialogues, and so when we're doing the larger groups, the Stoicons or the Stoicon X's, it's usually kind of a little bit higher level. There's not a lot of
programmatic, right?
Yeah. Whereas the smaller the groups and the smaller the audience, the more personal it becomes, and it's a lot easier to go into like, oh, I had this experience, and it like I was feeling angry, or I was feeling anxious, or I was feeling X, Y, and Z, and like, can you walk me through this? Or like, then I was thinking this, and this, and these are really kind of like these intimate like moments of community, as well as really kind of deep diving into a specific case in which we can apply like Stoic principles.
And I think that's something that's quite helpful, even for those who, so you can have like an individual dialogue, right? Where you have somebody who says, here's my problem. And then you have somebody else that says, okay, so what does Stoicism say about that? Now you've got 2 people involved, but you've also got the other people who are there in the room. And some of them might just sit back and watch and say, okay, how does this play itself out? I hadn't thought about this before. And some of them may contribute some additional things like saying, yeah, man, I have that problem too. here's what I do, or I want an answer to that, or here's something that so and so said that we should think about, from some Stoic text. You're right, that doesn't really happen at big conferences. And the other thing I was going to ask you about, so you've been doing the monthly groups, but you also or the weekly groups, but you also come to the monthly group. Mm-hmm. Obviously, we do some similar things. Oftentimes we focus on, like, we're going to read this portion of a text. Mm-hmm. So that's the same. What difference does it make when you're seeing people weekly as opposed to monthly?
It creates much more of a community. And especially because if you only see someone once a month, if you happen to miss or they happen to miss, and all of a sudden it's 2 months between seeing each other, and it's really hard to maintain those relationships with people over that long period of time, as well as it's a lot easier to see people in their progression if you're seeing them month to month and you're hearing about the ways that they're interacting with the world, week to week. And it's actually one of the things that I find really useful is, especially people that are on the path a little bit newer than I am, and to see how they react to certain things. And it's like, oh man, I used to react to those things in a similar way. And it's beneficial to see them as kind of a mirror image of you from a previous time. And it's like, oh, okay. And you see how much you have personally progressed on this path. I was like, okay, well, these things that they're talking about that like really bothered them, I've now experienced some of these things recently, and like, oh, these things aren't bothering me nearly as much or at all. And you're like, okay, I'm getting some feedback that says, okay, I can now, in reflection of this other person, see how much I've grown.
Yeah, that's a good experience coming from it, right?
Oh, that's a great experience.
Yeah. That reminds me of something. A friend of mine a long time ago, he brought up to me, and I think I may have told you about this in conversation before. He said, I've been doing Stoicism now for a couple of years. At first, I was seeing a lot of benefits because things were so screwed up, and now they're kind of on an even track. But I kind of feel like I'm in a rut. I hit a plateau of development. And I said, oh yeah, in other things, they call that the dark night of the soul. You have made some spiritual development, but if something's happening, it's happening sort of below your level of consciousness, so you're not seeing the immediate results that you used to be, right? Mm-hmm. It's sort of like in games when they set up games where you have levels, and to go from level 1 to level 2, super easy, right?
Right.
Because that's like a tutorial. And then level 2 to 10 might be, all sorts of milestones along the way. But then you have to grind and grind and grind and grind, right, to get to further levels.
It's an exponential scale.
Yeah, and there is no level thing in Stoicism or in anything in real life. It's just a metaphor taken from gaming. So you don't have that feedback that's telling you, oh man, you've really made tons and tons of progress. So I think it can be quite helpful for those who are at an intermediate to advanced level to interact with other people who are still struggling, not just to give them advice, but also to receive a kind of confirmation by looking at them that, yeah, I am on the right track. This is still working for me,
Right.
Is there anything else that you think needs to be added to this before we wrap up?
Well, I wanted to talk about, like, at the end of our weekly things, we do just a quick reflection. And you say, okay, here's the question. What was one thing that you, over this past week, did stoically, or in retrospect, could have handled more stoically? This is like a cribbing down of the 3 questions that Marcus Aurelius writes, the way which he stole from the Pythagoreans. Good artists still, right? Or good philosophers still. As Seneca says all the time, if the idea is good, then it should be free for everyone.
Exactly, yeah.
And I find this to be like a really useful way to end it. And I've copied the Minnesota Stoics, and they had a really good title for this idea of just the Stoic rewind. Just, hey, like here's the thing that has happened. And I've been finding it harder and harder to find really concrete examples of things that I had to deal with stoically, because they didn't even enter into my mind as like bothering me in the first place, and I didn't have to work at it. And so I was like, hey, that's bad in one sense, because I'm like kind of racking my brain trying to find like, okay, what happened that I had to like really work on? And the other part was like, oh, that's pretty dang good that I had to rack my brain to think and find something that's actually useful, or that I could have done more stoically. Or
Yeah, it's as if by handling things correctly at earlier points, you cut them off from being problems for you that you would have to deal with at later points, right? It's almost like a time saver in a way.
oh yeah, it's like, think of a snowball rolling down a hill and it's gathering more and more snow as it descends down the mountain, and you're just like, oh no, just catch it in the first 3 feet or something, and it's still small and super manageable, and you just kind of like toss it to some place where it's not going to make a big hole.
That's actually, I like that image quite a bit. That's a good one. You should write that down and keep it. Well, should we? What do you think? Should we close here?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. So thank you very much once again to Steve. Hopefully he is enjoying his slight vacation. And Greg, is there anything you'd like to plug?
No, nothing for me. Everybody knows where to find me. You just type Gregory Sadler in Google and plenty of stuff pops up. Anything you want to plug on your end?
I guess we've got a podcast, Wisdom for Life.
Oh, true. Yeah, we should.
Which is very similar to this particular format, maybe a little bit less cleaned up because it is originally designed to go live on the radio. But if you like this particular type of conversation about Stoicism and other things philosophy-based, specifically practical philosophy, then you'll find us. We're on all the major podcasting platforms as well as on Greg's YouTube channel.